Hi everyone, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At filmmakeru.com, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify their existing skill set. Every week we go live Friday at 2 p.m. with a film professional to chat about their experiences and give you a chance to ask questions. Today I'm joined by Jeffrey Wolf, editor and director. Welcome to the show, Jeffrey.
I'm muting. Hi,
Yeah.
how you doing?
Pretty good, thanks. Let's start. You've done a lot of comedies. What would you say are some of the tricks or techniques you've learned in terms of timing and pacing?
What? Sorry. Timing. Wow. First, I would say first instinct. Try to remember how you felt the first time you set something up. My thing with comedy is always to go for content, to kind of get the content first and the setup first, and then go back and polish for the funny part. Mm-hmm. I haven't worked on that many straight things that are comedies all the way through. A lot of the things are they're kind of driven by a narrative and then have comic overtones. Mm-hmm. So you really want to make sure the story works before you go in and balance out the comedy. But then also there's just so many tricks that you learn. Somebody, they ask like what an editor does. It's like you accumulate all these different tricks and ideas on how to make scenes work, make jokes work, make setup pieces work, and then you file through them as you're going, and you're probably making 1,000 decisions a second in terms of what you're going through.
Yeah.
It's the best answer I can give in that regard. But I also watch a lot of stand-up. I watch a lot of comedy. Early in my career, I took acting classes, not as an actor, but to sit in a room of acting students and kind of understand where they were going to get the performance that they needed, and that was that was very helpful. So I would say it's an observance and a cadence in some way too. You sort of form a certain cadence, rhythm, whatever.
Interesting. Do you get a lot of it from the actor's delivery? Because I think about your work on The Ref, and right. It's such a fast delivery the way he does it.
Right. Well, I was very lucky with Denis Leary and Ted Demme in that they had worked together a lot. They had done all these bits. I recommend to people to go to YouTube and look at the early commercials for MTV that Denis and Ted did. In fact, I don't think Denis's career as a movie actor was ever quite as strong when somebody other than Ted was directing them, because Ted really knew what that rhythm was and to play to that rhythm. So I thought in some way the editing became a part of that, I could see that coming and I could be consistent with it.
Interesting.
And then, somebody like Judy Davis and Kevin Spacey, it's funny talking about Kevin Spacey now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, but they were great comic actors. Mm-hmm. For being dramatic actors, they really understood, how to play comedy. So
yeah. Is there something you look for when you first get the set of rushes? What are you looking for in an actor's performance?
Authenticity, believability. Yeah, I always talk about Judy with the candles on her head in The Ref, for instance. Yeah. To act out a scene or who in King Kong, Jessica Lange. I always thought that she was so great. Same thing in Tootsie. She was so great because you believed that she believed that Dustin Hoffman was a woman and that King Kong was her lover. I mean, anybody who can kind of pull that off and put you in a situation where you're with them, that's what you're looking for. And the ref specifically too, you know, I don't know if everybody's seen the movie, but it's a table with 6, 8 people sitting at the table. So everything had to be done from everybody's point of view. So it's it was a very tricky kind of scene because sometimes performances aren't quite as good in one angle or another. And you're trying to figure out how to get to that angle from a conversation and things like that.
Mark Osborne says hello from MTO.
Oh, nice.
Love
that.
What would you say is the scene you're most proud of as an editor, like that, or that you found really, I guess, something you're excited about?
Well, the ones when I teach, the scenes that I show, the boom boom room scene from Life, because I feel, you know, early on, I started watching this show called Jury the other night on Netflix, and everything is like parallel action. There's like things happening, and parallel action is something that really didn't come into movie making as much until maybe like something like The French Connection. And it sort of became a New York style. I'm throwing that out there. I'm not even, you know, it's just a belief. But so I love that idea in the Boom Boom Room, that we had parallel action, we had great sound. It just like was one, it's a unit of itself. It kind of exists in its own world. And then another Ted Demme movie, Monument Avenue, a small film, but it stars Dennis Leary as well. And it's a scene where a bunch of guys are sitting around the table and they're telling stories, and you know, it goes from comedy to intense drama within a flash. So those are 2 scenes that I show a lot. I also show, on the tender note, I show the scene from Beautiful Girls of Natalie Portman skating around the rink, talking to Timothy Hutton about why they should get together, and Timothy Hutton explaining why they shouldn't. And I always felt that was sort of a very moving, you know, a scene where there's a movement in it, but it was very delicate and kind of beautiful. So.
Well, I think you showed that at Sight, Sound, and Story.
I may have.
Yeah. Now, you also worked on one of my personal favorites, which is Billy Madison. And we talked a bit before we went live. But when you got that script, what were your first impressions? Because it is such an outlandish sort of film.
So, I mean, the story of Billy Madison is kind of an interesting place where the movie business went. I had been offered to work on Dumb and Dumber, and turned it down, and because I just thought it was
dumb.
It just didn't fit into the kind of, you know, a genre that I understood from a comedy point of view. And then my children, who were, you know, kind of in their late or early teens and late teens, said that was really crazy. You shouldn't have done that. And then when Billy Madison came along, I read the script and I thought similar about it. And then they convinced me to say yes. And so I went up to Toronto, which is where we shot it. And it was a bizarre experience. The director got fired in the person who hired me got fired in the first 4 or 5 days of shooting, because he wasn't making it stupid enough. It's funny because the director and I have remained very good friends over the years, but so it was this interesting situation where we were in, what was the big sound house in Toronto for years?
Well, there's which one would, because Tattersall had a place before.
That was before Tattersall.
Yeah, I just can't remember the name.
Yeah. Anyway, all the crew would stand at dailies, and already crew at dailies are all looking at what they do, but nobody was getting it at all. But Adam and my 9-year-old son were sitting. We'd all sit through dailies and just laugh their heads off. So we figured that was good. And then when we previewed it the first time, we took it out of town because there was a fear that no one would think it was funny. And we went to Phoenix and it scored a 98%.
Wow.
In Phoenix. So they kind of knew they were onto something, but even that movie, you know, his later movies, really, Adam Sandler, they made more money as people got more used to that kind of humor.
His style, yeah. That's crazy. 98.
Yeah, I was saying earlier, we still, you know, around our house, we still use quotes from Billy Madison as part of our vernacular. And when I see Adam, occasionally, like he had this new movie last year, a very intense, that Uncut Gems.
Yeah.
And I saw him at a screening of that, and he, you know, we kind of go right back into Billy Madison. It doesn't take long to kind of get there. So
the thing that's always fascinating me about Adam Sandler is, for whatever reason, his image is always around his comedies, but he does a lot of dramas. Like he'll do a couple of comedies and a really, you know, big drama of some sort. And he doesn't seem to get recognized for that as much, right? Like it seems like everyone only thinks of him as comedy, but he's really out there as an actor.
Yeah, like many comedians, though, he's a very complicated, very complicated guy. I think there's a lot of different personalities floating around in there, and the better directors, I thought, in Uncut Gems, they did he did an amazing job, and the directors took him someplace that I don't know if he'd ever been before. But
yeah, well, and same with Punch Drunk Love, like just pushed him into a new area that he wasn't used to.
Yeah, and the Judd Apatow movies, you know, but he's a, you know, he's sort of a sad sack. I mean, I never think of him as anything. Whenever you see him, he's just sort of like a regular. I run into him in restaurants. He's just always kind of a regular Joe, you know.
Yeah, well, like most actors, right? You expect them to be the characters on screen, and you get to see them.
Not him.
You also got to do the film Holes, which has sort of become like a classic for a lot of young people.
Right.
So can you tell me about how that came about and how you got involved with that?
Yeah, well, I'll go behind the scenes a little bit with that. And that was let's see, how can I frame that movie? A friend of mine was an executive at Walden Media, and somebody I knew from the Demme days, and they were having trouble with that film. And I came on like while they were still shooting, and it was this very interesting combination because the editor I was working with was kind of he had been an architecture student, and he was really good at architecture. The film, Andy Davis was a cinematographer, so he just went out and just shot tons and tons and tons of footage, but without any real design as to how it was going to go together. So this other editor put a lot of energy into building the story, you know, building the structure of the movie, but it didn't have the heart of the book. And you know, I think one of my strong points you asked about comedy, but I think one of my strong points in comedy too is having an ear for dialogue, and that's what they brought me in to do. And so I sort of ended up cutting all the scenes that had to do with the relationships between people, and kind of adding the temp music in to kind of give it the feeling that it had. A very interesting problem, you know, they probably had this in the Harry Potter books too, is that the readers of those books, when they see the movie, they don't want anything to be missing. They want it to be exactly as it was in the book. So if you take something out or you change something, the audience notices it right away. The other interesting thing with Holes is it was a Disney film, and you know, with children's films, the audience ratings are always very high, but the Holes ratings were extremely high from the very beginning. So they kind of knew they had something that they were going to go with. So
We're
But
getting
I
a
know
lot
it's
of
from that generation. It's kind of like they're To Kill a Mockingbird or something.
yeah, yeah. Well, I was gonna say we got it like as soon as we started talking about it, we have a lot of people on the social media saying they love the film. Uh,
Yeah.
so what would you say so you're saying that like it had to follow the book closely. Was there anything you guys removed that you were worried would get you
I
in
can't
trouble?
remember exactly, but that was always sort of, if the tree was over here and not over, I mean, it was very specific things that
Hmm.
um, that they were concerned, they were concerned with, and how that would be treated. But then on the other hand, I remember the studio said you have to take 5 minutes out of the movie. I don't care where. It just has to be 5 minutes. And so they came up with these kind of bizarre ideas of, cut the Patricia Arquette story out, and everybody's going, no, we can't do that. But it was sort of a typical studio threat to kind of push you into bending to their way.
Yeah. It's so weird sometimes the threats you hear, you're like remove 5 minutes. It's like where? Like if you could say that, this character isn't working, can you cut her down or him
Right.
down? It makes more sense, but
I do want to say at this moment, I haven't advertised this too much, but I've worked with every Arquette there is. Starting back to when I was a kid, I met Charlie Weaver, who was
yeah.
the grandfather. He used to hang out at this bar in New York City when he worked on the Jack Parr show. And then I worked with Rosanna Arquette on Baby It's You, and with Patricia on Holes, with David on Beautiful Girls. And are there any more?
I don't know.
I think that's
I'm sure there
oh,
is.
and then their father was in a movie called it was a snowboarding movie that I did in Vancouver. The father was in that.
So is it like SNL? You get a smoking
I
jacket
should
when you've been on there
I
5
should get
times?
at least a jacket. I've been meaning to write them and tell them. Anyway.
Wow. Is there from the movie Holes, what would you say was the most challenging scene?
Oh, huh. Gosh. Well, all the stuff outside with John Boyd and Sigourney Weaver, those are characters that are really, they're a little over the top, but they're, you want them to be scary, but you want to believe them. I think that particularly the scene in the house where, she's trying to figure stuff out, but it was Shia's first movie. It was a lot of people's first films working with those bigger actors. So just kind of keeping the whole thing, real and good, I think was the challenge of that film more than one particular scene. The dragon scene, the little dragons were hard because that was pretty early in the CGI kind of world, and we didn't have a super big budget for that, and kind of making that work, I think, was a big challenge. So,
I'm sure.
yeah. What was your favorite scene in it?
It's hard because because I saw it in the theater when it first came
Right.
out. It's been so long since I've seen it, and I had never read the book, so it was one of
Right.
those things where it's hard because it's something that sticks out. And then I think I rewatched it when you and I talked before.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah, it's funny because it's not that often that I go see a movie maybe at the premiere that I've worked on, but
yeah,
whenever it comes on TV, if I happen to see it as I'm scrolling, I'll always stop and watch a scene or two just to,
yeah,
and then kind of the self-hatred comes in. Like, why did they do that? Where'd you cut there? You
yeah,
start remembering all the stuff. But I once asked Elizabeth Ashley years and years ago I was an assistant on a film, and I told her I'd like this movie that she'd been in, and she said, kind of like that Marlon Brando line, was that the one where my head was shaved? Have you ever heard that story
yeah.
about?
No, I haven't.
Well, she said, honey, I just make them and then I forget them. But Marlon Brando, when asked about his role in Apocalypse Now, he said, is that the one where my head was shaved? So
Yeah. We do have a question here from Janine, and she wants to know, how do you address studio requests to cut out parts of a film that you disagree with?
Well, today's studio executives are a little, they're younger probably. So I'm not exactly sure how you deal with that today as much, but when I was doing those movies, you tended to try to talk them out of it and or do the note and then say, I don't think the note works. But it's very, I'm not one who was afraid of notes. I never kind of put my, every situation is different, so it's really hard to answer that.
Mm-hmm.
In the bio, you mentioned this movie Long Shots, which not many people talk about that movie. I'm surprised
Right.
I've seen it.
I rewatched it like a month ago. So,
well, there's a movie where it wasn't designed as a comedy, and the Weinsteins decided that we have to go back and reshoot for comedy, like people running into goalposts and things like that. And they brought in a comedy director to work with the director who was current to the film. And it was a lot of difficulty, kind of, because I believe that some things were funny, but I believe that running into the goalpost wasn't funny. So it's sort of like, walking the line between the two worlds was more what the challenge was than convincing somebody of one or the other. You have to be very careful. Allegiances are so much a part of all this.
Yeah.
The movie Life, Brian Glazer had one idea of what the movie was supposed to be, and Ted had another idea. But the company didn't decide what their idea was until after the film was already shot and cut. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Now, one of our listeners says this is Ryan. He says, "I'm happy to hear that you also second guess your choices long after you're done."
Yeah.
Because now he feels seen. Now you've also directed, and so
yes,
you're currently directing documentaries. So I'm wondering, what did you learn from it as an editor that you carried over into your directing career?
Well, first of all, I learned about how hard directing was, and so it gave me a whole new respect, because I directed TV, a little bit of TV here and there too. I had a whole new level of respect for directors after directing. So, I mean, we're all out there doing a craft. I often tell directors, look, I've edited 30 movies. You've probably directed 2 or 3. I have the experience that I have is an important element to this. And so I actually don't, as of the last couple of films, I haven't edited my own documentaries because of the respect that I have for what an editor brings to the table. So I think that this most recent documentary actually has performance in it. So I'm trying to start to segue into making these combinations of things. They're less documentaries than they are, meditations, I guess, on subject matters. So, but like this, and it's interesting because my first one was kind of put into a TV world, and this one now is getting theatrical consideration because of that. So,
well, and do you want to tell us about your new one?
Yeah, this
trailer.
This new one is. So I've been interested. We were talking earlier. I've been collecting. My grandmother, who was an immigrant from Austria, had an antique shop in Minneapolis called the Antique Shop of Old Vienna. And so growing up, when visiting, that was sort of part of our world. And so the accumulation of things became something I started doing as well. And I got focused on what's called outsider art or self-taught art. And I, all through my editing career, I was collecting the material. And then in 2000, I started making small films about some of the artists that I had contact with. And then that grew into bigger films. And then the one before this was a 50-minute, this one's a feature-length documentary about an artist named Bill Traylor, who was born in 1853. He was born into an enslaved family. Then he became a sharecropper for 40 years. And then in his 80s, on a street corner in Montgomery, Alabama, he sat down and made about 1,500 drawings using found materials and paint and pencils that he would procure from people along the way. So that he became very, I mean, I didn't discover him. He's become very famous. The Smithsonian had a one-man show last year of his work. So I took on the idea of trying to tell the story of 100 years of the South through the purview of this artist, because a lot of the work reflected the circumstances that he may or may not have observed firsthand, but probably knew about in some form or other. So yeah, so the COVID has kind of slowed it down, but it's gonna premiere in New York and the theaters in 2021. So I'm looking
Amazing.
forward. Yeah.
Well, so I should have asked this question before, but in terms of folk art, like when we were emailing, I mentioned Maud Lewis, and her story is similar, where it's like she's just painting at her house, and
do people know the name of that film? You should mention the name of that film.
I said it earlier, but Bill Traylor Chasing Ghosts is
our film is out, but the Maud
Lewis.
The Maud Lewis movie, because it's a lovely little film with Ethan Hawke.
Yeah, it's just called Maud.
Yeah.
But yeah, and an art collector or someone comes along, discovers her, and is part of the understanding of folk art that it has to be, in a sense, like done not out of like I want to be an artist, but just out of like the need or the want to create.
Yeah, like my Twitter handle is self-taught.
Yeah.
I'm actually in the film business. I am not self-taught. I was an apprentice for many great editors, from Alan Heim to Dede Allen to Barry Malkin. But the concept of self-taught is something I'm very intrigued by. And I don't do it so much anymore, but I used to use the analogy of going into a flea market for editing, like when I would teach editing, to just always be in a situation where you're evaluating things. You're looking at something, whether it be folk art or any kind of art, but to sit and look at that object or thing or creation and kind of see it from a lot of different points of view and angles. And I think if you can do that, then that's like the first step to being a great editor. It's not, it's kind of like being a critic in some way. And in fact, many editors are, people talk about editors as critics in the sense that, they're, Aaron Mavakian used to say to us that, an editor had to have a healthy contempt for the material, because you're always sort of like judging it and trying to find the beauty and beauty in quotes, the perfect thing in it. And with experience, certain things are supposed to be a certain way, but trying to mold it into that thing is where that challenge is. So.
Now, you just mentioned that you had assisted Dede Allen. Is that correct?
Yeah.
You got to tell me, what was that like? Because she's a legend in the industry.
Dede Allen, the big scissors, we used to call it. I worked with Dede Allen on a movie called The Wiz.
Which is also a classic. It's great.
And I actually was on that film so long, and I went from being a apprentice picture editor to assistant music editor, I guess. Dede was a one of a kind. What do you want to know? I mean, well, she was dogged about every, the hardest working person in show business. She you know, she'd come up to you at 10:30 at night and say, "Isn't this fun?"
That's awesome.
But she also had to be a part of how everything worked. And I think that's what probably drove people the craziest with her. But she also, one of the things I did for her, I was her projectionist, because was The Apprentice, because she, after daily, she would come back and watch all the dailies again in the editing room, but projected, because in her mind, you know, doing it projected brought on another kind of reality to it. But on that movie, I met the young Michael Jackson and the amazing production designer Albert Whitlock, and I worked very close with Quincy Jones on it, and then, but one of the greatest things about Dee Dee was that when she did Reds and everybody was afraid to work on Reds, I was up for a film, an Arthur Penn film called Four Friends, and the day that I had to answer Dee Dee about working on Reds, I got the job on Four Friends. So I was happy to sort of be able to not be in that world if I could help it, but still, you know, keep my relationship. And then many years later, my first big editing job on a film, a Burt Reynolds film, the producer said, "If you can get Dee Dee to recommend you, I'll hire you." And so it was also one of those situations where the guy called my editing room at 10 o'clock at night. I was working on The Equalizer. He was happy I was in the editing room. And I called Dee Dee on the phone. She was in California, and she called the producer, and I got the job. So
Wow.
So I'm forever indebted.
Wow. And you also worked with Alan Heim, who's
who's still a very close friend. We worked on Network together. But, you know, funny, you know, I guess Alan makes this public, but Alan was friends with a very good art dealer friend of mine. They used to, before Alan was in the film business, or while he was in the film business, he had an antique store on the Upper East Side.
Oh, wow.
With this guy. So Alan and I share the love for all this material as well. So we're still very close friends and see each other often as we can. And Barry was a great editor. He just passed away, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And Aaron Mavakian was a great mentor. So yeah, there were a few good people working around New York at the time. So
wow. Now, if you
Jerry Greenberg also.
Yeah, it was great editor. When you're approaching like when you're looking at a script, what do you look for in the scripts that you like to choose?
That's interesting. So I read scripts now on my iPad, and I always, because you can like read them fast, and I always sit in the same place in my house when I read them, because kind of like an editing thing where I want the exact same experience every time I read a script. I want to be in the same place. I never quite thought of it as much as lately as that, but so I'm looking for readability. I'm looking for what's filmic and what, you know, what's a good read. I'm also, and this is, I wouldn't recommend this to everyone, but I'm also looking for what's different than something that I've done before. You know, I think everybody always wants to hire editors for what they did before because it reminds them of their film in some way. I actually, you know, I like the challenge of like going into something that's different than something I've done before.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why when you look at my film history, it's sort of a, you know, there's drama, there's action, there's comedy, there's musical, you know, so I think it's you know, makes it more interesting.
So what would you suggest for young film editors getting into the business to have a similar career where it's like they can do an action, they can do a comedy? Because that's one thing I've heard from most editors is, oh, I get pigeonholed as the comedy person.
Yeah. It depends, you know, if you're early in your career, I would say, you know, I think I'm I don't know if I mentioned on this, but I have a son who's an editor, and he started very early doing, promo things, like 5-minute things where he had to tell the story, beginning, middle, and end in 5 minutes. I mean, any of those kinds of industrial kind of things that you can do, don't be afraid of those. You can't get too enamored with it either. It's sort of like, when I started, you made much more money in the sound department than you did in the picture department, because you were there longer hours and it was a different kind of phenomena. But you could easily, if that's not what you wanted to do, if that's not what your passion is, it was, you had to sort of get away from the dependence on the salary and just keep moving on and take that into another area. And yeah, so the idea of that kind of well-roundedness, to be good at every, at all the different things, I think is a really smart way to go. I don't know, I don't have an answer for the typecast, because I do think it's true. Particularly in editing, I'm not sure, people who are hiring editors know what editors actually do. So, one of the questions I'm always asked, like, will you look at all the transitions and make sure that the transitions are good? I mean, those are the kinds of conversations you have in editing. So I would just say, try to be good at everything. Try to really get good at all the different aspects of it.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid. I believe in, again, I'm a little further in the career part, but I believe in reverse mentoring also, in the sense where I listen, I try to include my crew in the work and get them invested in what's going on. So, so that when I do need an honest opinion about something, or, it's coming from an educated place also. So.
Now, I have one last question that I want to ask you here. And now, we've been in this COVID pandemic for several months now.
Right.
What would you recommend from your Netflix or Hulu or whatever your streaming service of choice? What would you recommend for people to watch?
Oh, to watch. God, it's funny that you say that, because I have a list that I made earlier today of, here, let me dig that out, for people. Somebody had asked me for recommendations. So here are some of the recommendations. Two really interesting documentaries. One's called The Artist and the Thief.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Really good. It's hard to believe it's a documentary. It's so well structured. Another one's called Crip Camp.
Okay. What's that one about?
It's about a camp around the Woodstock Film Festival for disability kids, and they go back, they catch up with everybody, how many, were 40 years later or something like that?
Yeah.
And it's produced and directed by one of the people who was at the camp back in those days. And actually, it's the producer, the main producer is the wife of that guy who happened to be in New York sound editor named Sarah Boulder. People may know her. My wife and I just finished watching Giri Hasi. It's a Japanese show on Netflix. Giry. We love Somebody Feeds Phil.
Yeah.
A great show about design is called Abstract on Netflix. It's hour-long documentaries about designers, whether it be photographers or covers in the New Yorker. We like the Linda Ronstadt documentary.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of the TV show we liked. We hadn't seen Killing Eve or any of her other shows.
Fleabag.
Yeah, Fleabag. So we enjoyed those a lot. A really lovely really interesting movie by the guy who did La La Land called The Eddy. It's on Netflix. It's with Damien Chazelle.
Chazelle, yeah.
Yeah. It's a jazz club in Paris. It's 8 episodes. Really, it's cut like, it's a really great editing thing because it's cut in a jazz format. And it's still, one of the stars is the woman who is the star of Cold War, the Polish film from last year.
Oh, wow.
She's fantastic. Yeah, so there's that. How about, what have you seen? Somebody recommended Rake. I don't know, has anybody seen Rake?
I haven't seen Rake.
R-A-K-E. It's an Australian
Oh.
film. What have you seen? Anything you
I
like?
haven't. So I've been watching, I guess, how do I put this nicely? I guess films that are sort of just like you don't really have to pay attention. So like, like a bunch of the Netflix ones that came up, like Extraction. Like I watched it. It's, it won't be something I show students, but it was good. Greyhound that just came out. And I have a stack of like, historically significant or, films I should be watching ready to go. But with the pandemic, I just haven't had the urge.
Well, it's funny because we just signed up for Criterion, and Criterion is kind of taking some of the slack up from, the fact that Netflix and Amazon are producing their own. They're not buying as much from the outside. They're producing their own stuff. So Criterion is starting to pick up things that they hadn't necessarily picked up before, kind of more contemporary things. But we watched Clio 5 to 7, which was a movie made in 1962 in Paris. And it was so wonderful by woman director, French woman director. I'll think of her name in a second. But yeah, so we're trying to find that balance as well. But you got to drop the Greyhound stuff and get into some of the deeper stuff.
I know. I got really into samurai films for a while, just before the pandemic, and samurai and westerns because they're so similar in that. And I was really into, and I'm gonna butcher this because I've had people tell me it's said both ways, but Harikari. Have you seen that one? Or Harikari? That one's really fascinating because it's a samurai who comes and asks permission at the temple to commit harikari, where he kills himself. And then he's about to do it, and he's like, I just want to tell you why I'm doing this. And then it's his story. Yeah, and it's really fascinating. Yeah. So that one I would recommend to people. That one in High Noon.
The original High Noon.
Yeah. Because I was, both are really fascinating. So
yeah, that's it's kind of like that short of the guy getting ready to jump off the plane.
Yeah. What's that one called again?
Yeah, I'll think of it in a second. But
oh, we'll think about it once we're done. So, well, thank you so much for letting us chat today and answering people's questions. For those who are watching, next week we're going to have Ellen Kuras, who has done cinematography for Spike Lee. She's done films such as Eternal Sunshine for the Spotless Mind. So definitely check in on that next week at Friday at 2 p.m. And thanks again, Jeffrey, for joining me. And next time I'm in New York, we'll have to grab a coffee.
Sounds good. We'll talk soon. All right.
Have a good one. Bye.
Everyone.